Hey, how you doing? It's Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. We're going to pick up today with Unit 10, which is continuation of the unit that we were just on. Of course, we did Part 1 on World War II, and now we're going to pick up with Part 2 of WWII. Now, when we're talking about this period, of course, in the history of the United States of America, we're talking about from the interests of the United States of America in 1941 after Pearl Harbor to the conclusion of the war with the defeat of Japan in 1945. What we're going to do, of course, is start with Unit 10, once again, World War II, Part 2. But we're going to start with Lesson 6, America Mobilizes for War. If and when a country does go to war, it's not just as simple as just going to war. Things have to happen in order, of course, for that particular war effort to happen. And in the United States of America, we're no exception. When World War II happens and we get involved in World War II, there's a certain amount of things, of course, that have to happen before we can be effective, of course, in this particular conflict or any conflict. The unit focus question, of course, is the same as it was last week. This is why did efforts to prevent World War II fail? And then how did the home front effort bolster America's success in World War II? Once again, we want to answer those questions, the unit focus questions, until we conclude the unit. Here we have the vocabulary, academic vocabulary, and content vocabulary. We encourage you, of course, to take your journals and define these words and concepts as we go. And what we will try to do, of course, is to point them out and address them as they come up in the lesson. Here's the lesson focus question, which we will attempt to answer, of course, at the conclusion of the lesson. How did American businesses mobilize to support the war effort? And how did the war effort affect minorities at home and overseas? Well, with that, we're going to go ahead and begin. And we'll start with the do now activities. So take out your journals and write down the following statement. Imagine you're living in the United States during World War II, and what are some of the ways you think ordinary Americans might contribute to the war effort, even if they're not in the military? Go ahead and take a few moments, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss what some possible responses could have been. Okay, we're back. Now, we asked you, of course, with the do now activities to go through and imagine if you were living in the United States of America during World War II, and what would be some of the things that you could do, of course, to support the war effort, even if you weren't involved in the military. Well, one of the things we could do is tell you not to complain, because during the war, of course, there are going to be certain things that you used to be able to access quite quickly, you're not going to be able to access as much. During World War II, and even in World War I, we're going to experience rationing. And what rationing simply means is that we have to basically take what limited resources we have and we have to make them last. And during World War II, we're going to find that because the emphasis, of course, was making sure the troops had what they needed and then our allies had what they needed, we at home, back in the States, did our part by accepting that we weren't going to have the advantages that we almost always had. So what we're telling you is one of the biggest things that you can do, of course, is ration. Then support the war effort. You support the war effort by buying Liberty bonds and not speaking against the war. We're going to start with the U.S. Military in World War II, and as we said, mobilization has to take place before the war can happen. In June 1940, America approved a peacetime draft by passing the Selective Service Act of 1940 to ready for the possibility of war. Now keep in mind now, we're not involved in the war. The war starts in 1939. The United States of America is not involved, of course, until 1941. So we create a peacetime draft because we started to recognize, because of FDR, the possibility, of course, of us getting involved. The military remained segregated with white and black combat units. The Double V campaign was one of the responses to that. It was launched by the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper to promote victory over the Axis powers, but it also promoted victory over injustice at home here in America when it came to civil rights. Despite segregation, blacks fought with distinction, particularly the Tuskegee Airmen in their iconic red tail airplanes. And the Japanese Americans in the 442nd Regiment combat team also fought with distinction, as did the Navajo Indians that served as code talkers during the war. And Hispanics, with 17 Hispanics receiving the Congressional Medal of Honor, and 500,000 Jews who fought with distinction. Now, they're not just the only ones, of course, that are involved in the war effort. One minority that we kind of leave out sometimes, we don't talk about in terms of their contribution as much, is the American women. American women got involved in the war effort in non-combatant roles, meaning that they weren't fighting, but they were support personnel. In the Navy Coast Guard, they were called the Waves. In the Army, they were called the WACs. And in the Air Force, they were called the WASPs. Here's a picture of a recruiting poster that was created by James Montgomery Flagg. It's one of the most iconic pieces of World War II memorabilia. One of the things that you'll notice about this flag, the brilliance of James Montgomery Flagg, is that when you look at this picture of Uncle Sam, and no matter where you go into the room, it looks like he's pointing right at you, and he's saying that we want you for the American war effort. Here's a picture of some of the Tuskegee Airmen. Here's Ovita Cup Halby. She was called Colonel Hobby. I think I have a picture of her also over here behind me here. And in looking at Miss Hobby, we have to understand that one of the things that she did is she was called Colonel Hobby. She was a lieutenant colonel in the Women's Army Corps, or the WWII. So it's not just men, of course, that provide a contribution in this war. We're going to find that women will provide a very significant contribution as well. Mobilizing industry. Mobilization for World War II was a joint effort of business and government in the United States of America. The Reconstruction Finance Committee that was created all the way back during the Depression is going to be used to issue loans to businesses that converted to wartime production. The goal of mobilization was to create a two-ocean navy and build thousands of planes. And by 1942, American industry was doing its job, and one Liberty ship was being produced every day by Henry Kaiser using Ford's assembly line techniques. You have to understand, in 1941, of course, when Pearl Harbor happens in December 1941, when it happens, American ships are going to be impacted, or American Navy is going to be impacted, and we're going to have to do what we can to make sure that we not only replenish our naval supply, but also provide naval supplies to our allied partners. Here's a picture of Henry Kaiser. And once again, the brilliance of Kaiser was the fact that he used assembly line techniques that were used for cars by Ford to create at least one Liberty ship per day. America on the home front. To support the war effort, American citizens had to sacrifice and accept rationing, as we talked about earlier, as a part of their daily life. Victory gardens were planted, and even Hollywood produced movies in support of the war effort, which included advertisements for war bonds. Women worked in war factories, like Rosie the Riveter, who becomes a symbol of the World War II working woman. African Americans worked and were protected from discrimination for the very first time by the federal government, by FDR issuing Executive Order 8802, which prevented discrimination when it came to government jobs in the war effort. Mexican migrants were embraced again in America after the war began. The Bracero movement was created to allow Mexicans to come back to the United States of America to work in those fields of the American Southwest. So everybody has a role to play. Here is some World War II propaganda that we put out, of course. War bonds keep us flying. War bonds, she's ready to buy war bonds. And here's a picture of Rosie the Riveter. She's a strong American woman, of course, that does her part to make sure that the men overseas have the things that they need in terms of equipment and machinery to do the job that they've been sent to do. Violence on the home front. In the Sun Belt region of the United States, the population increased as Americans moved to the Deep South in California, where war industry was being created, which contributed to the rise in racial violence. The increase in the population in some cases led to violence, as the Zoot Suit Riots had happened in Los Angeles between the Navy and some of the Hispanic men, of course, that lived in that particular region. Japanese Americans were faced internment and violence as they were relocated from the West Coast to detention camps in the interior of the nation for fear that they would help the Japanese in the case of the Japanese invasion. A lot of Americans were afraid that the Japanese enemy would be aided by Japanese Americans, of course, in the war effort, and as a result, they were removed from the West Coast and placed into these 10 internment camps that were scattered throughout the middle portion of the country. Here's a picture of the Sun Belt, where a lot of the war industries were created. Korematsu v. U.S., we talked about the Japanese internment, how they were taken out from their homes, of course, and they were placed in these internment camps. We're going to find that it's going to be a bone of contention after the war, but the court case Korematsu v. U.S. upholds the idea that it's okay to remove the Japanese from their homes and place them in internment camps because it was a matter of national security. Now, they identified the Japanese in three ways. The Nisei were the first generation born in Japan. They were not. The Issei were a generation born in Japan, not a citizen. The Nisei was second generation born in America to immigrant parents, and they were citizens. And the Sansei were the third generation born to the Nisei, and they were citizens. Here's a picture of those internment camps. Every time you see a triangle, that's where you see internment camp. Here is a worksheet that we want you to take about 20 minutes or so and work on, of course, and what it does is it kind of summarizes the things that we've talked about in lesson 1, unit number 10, mobilization of American war effort. We won't go over the answer to these questions, but we do have an answer key, of course, in the reference section at the end of the unit, and we encourage you, of course, to go there and look at that. Lesson focus question: how did American businesses mobilize to support the war effort, and how did the war effort affect minorities at home and overseas? Well, with the aid of government incentives like cost-plus contracts, businesses were able to make a product with government money and receive a percentage of the profit from sales. Businesses also received loans to help them convert to wartime production, and businesses also turned to tried and true production techniques like the assembly line to increase speed and efficiency in wartime manufacturing. Second question: how did the war effort affect minorities at home and overseas? Well, minorities still face segregation in the military and were only allowed to fight with the British and French in some situations. European allies in the military and on the home front generally treated African Americans and other minorities as equals. Some African Americans would stay on in Europe when the war concluded because of the good treatment that they received during World War II and refused to come back to the United States of America to live, or come here and then return back to, to Europe and places like Great Britain and France. FDR issued Executive Order 8802, which allowed discrimination in employment of workers which benefited African Americans. Once again, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present, and this is World War II. And remember, it's America's history, and since it's America's history, don't take my word for it. Do your own research and draw your own conclusions, and we will see you next time.